The San Francisco Call on June 7, 1895, reported the following, quote, "The ship was overloaded, badly loaded, top heavily loaded. All agree upon that. When the gale struck her, she weathered it, but badly. Then she careened. There was a list to starboard, and she did not right again. Men called out to the captain to cut away the deckloading of heavy spars. The captain was obdurate. He knew his business, or fancied that he did, and would brook no suggestions from what he called the terrified and panic-stricken passengers."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Colima loses against the storm.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Colima was a single-screw steamship with an iron hull. The 2,909-ton ship had been built in 1873 and had come under the ownership of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. She was known to travel a regular route that took her from San Francisco to ports in Mexico and South America, ending in Panama before she would return once again to California. It was such a regular route for her that when she departed San Francisco on the 18th of May, 1895, it was noted that it was going to be her 129th voyage to Panama. She had been in the dock for several months and underwent maintenance, including cleaning her boilers, which were announced to be good for several more years of service before they would need to be overhauled. Indeed, the ship was considered to be in general good condition and completely seaworthy, despite being over 20 years old. In total, on board the Colima, as she departed San Francisco, there were 192 people on board. 40 cabin passengers, not including children and servants, 80 steerage passengers, a majority of whom were Chinese, and 72 members of the crew under the command of Captain Taylor. The voyage began well, and they arrived in Manzanillo harbor without incident. Nothing of concern would occur until the afternoon of the 26th of May, when the Colima would leave Manzanillo harbor. Almost as soon as they left the harbor, the ship faced growing winds and increasingly rough seas, and throughout the night, the Colima was traveling at such a low speed that she hardly had any steerage way in the face of the storm. Captain Taylor ordered increasing power from the engines in a desperate fight to keep her head into the storm. There would later be some discrepancies in stories about how the passengers responded to the terrible storm. The female steerage passengers, as well as the portion of the passengers in steerage who were from China, were not allowed onto the deck, and therefore had no way of knowing what was happening, but were certainly aware that the ship was being tossed about violently. The cabin passengers, who had access to more information and could see the crew at work on the decks, were said for the most part to remain calm through the night, since the ship still seemed to be weathering the storm. That was until around 8 in the morning, when the barometer suddenly dropped so quickly that the entire crew knew that they were about to face a tremendous storm. Still, the crew acted quickly under the command of Captain Taylor. The plugs were removed so that the ship could be steered from the stern in case it was needed, everything on deck was lashed down firmly, and the awnings on board were all taken in so they could not catch the wind. This flurry of action alarmed some of the passengers, especially Professor Whiting, who was taking a vacation with his family. It was admitted by Sutherland, one of the other cabin passengers, that he and some of the other young men in the cabin had teased Professor Whiting for his panic and alarm at the storm they were now caught in. Though the passengers were not aware of it, the crew was beginning to realize what grave danger they were in. No matter how much power Captain Taylor asked for from the engines, there was not enough headway that could be produced to keep the ship with her bow into the storm due to the high winds. A Belgian musician named Gustav Rowan decided it was best to start distributing the life preservers just in case. Rowan was not the only passenger who thought this would be a reasonable precaution either. But the ship's steward stood in their way and told them to leave the life preservers alone. The other passengers obeyed, but Rowan was more persistent, in spite of the steward ordering Rowan to go to the forward part of the vessel, away from the other passengers, instead of gathering life preservers. It was explained by another passenger that the steward believed that distributing life preservers would only cause panic among the passengers. Undeterred, Rowan avoided the steward who was trying to block him, grabbed the life preservers, and handed them to as many people as he could. The steward, still trying to stop him, followed after him, telling him, quote, "What are you taking those things down for? You'll have to put them up again. I'll not put them up for you." End quote. The steward continued to tell the passengers not to mess with the life preservers, that even if the ship did go down, they would have enough time to go to the lifeboats. And Rowan continued to pass out life preservers and show people how to put them on. At this point, the ship had been laboring to right herself. She would list and then slowly correct. At around 10:15 in the morning, the ship rolled so violently that 3 of the starboard lifeboats, which had been swung out on their davits as a precaution, were lost. At one point, one of the crew members reported that the chief engineer of the ship had come up on deck and had a short conversation with the quartermaster, though he was not certain what the conversation had been about. He did say that, as the chief engineer turned away, his eyes looked dead, and in retrospect, though he did not think about it then, the chief engineer had a premonition of what was to come. It was said that some of the passengers had already suggested to Captain Taylor that he should cut away the deck of cargo spars, but that he had refused to do so. It would not be until the ship developed a 45-degree list and remained that way that Captain Taylor shouted for the third mate Hansen to cut away the deck cargo. Third mate Hansen went to follow the orders, but he never had the chance. The Colima had finally lost her fight against the wind and waves, and had fallen into a trough in the seas so violently that the ship shuddered. In quick succession, 3 large waves struck her, preventing her from recovering. Rowan, who was still trying to distribute life preservers, was thrown down and injured. It was such an impact that the passengers would later tell the newspapers that the ship had struck a reef, a story that was only later corrected when members of the crew were able to tell their side of the story with more complete information. While third mate Hansen was sent out to cut away the deck load, first mate Griffiths, meanwhile, was given the order to begin to launch lifeboats. Two lifeboats were launched successfully. Lifeboat number 5 under the supervision of First Mate Griffiths, and Lifeboat number 2 under the supervision of Second Officer Langhorne. And people were loaded onto them. Second Officer Langhorne's boat was swamped as soon as it was lowered, and everyone on board of it was lost. 5 minutes after the ship had made its initial permanent list, it sank into the ocean, with Captain Taylor clinging to the railing of the bridge so that he was not thrown off but remained at his post to the end. As the ship went down, he gave 3 blasts of the steam whistle. As it went down, Third Mate Hansen reported that the boilers burst, ripping the decking from under his feet and throwing him and a good deal of debris into the water. The debris would offer a new danger to those who were in the water, and people who were struck by it often sank below the waves and were not seen again. Rowan was among those to be struck by pieces of sunken vessel, but he had put on a life preserver while he had distributed them, and he managed to regain the surface. though he was badly injured. The cabin passenger, Sutherland, had been lucky. He had slid across the deck and fallen into a boat. In the boat, there were more passengers who had gotten in out of desperation, including Professor Whiting, his wife, their nanny, and their 4 children. As the Colima went down, a part of the rigging of the ship fell on the boat and carried it under. Sutherland regained the surface, as did the boat, and Sutherland crawled back into the boat. He picked up Professor Whiting from the water, as well as Mrs. Whiting and another female passenger. He saw another passenger named Peters clinging to the stern and trying to climb back in. Almost immediately, the boat capsized in the waves. 5 times, Sutherland righted the boat again, only to have it capsize. By now, he was the only person regaining the surface. The other 3 had all been lost. He thought that Peters was lost as well, but he later learned that he had been among those rescued. He had just given up on the boat. The final time the boat capsized, it proved to be another stroke of fortune for Sutherland. He came back to the surface under the upturned boat, and was protected from the debris when the ship's boiler exploded. Sutherland righted the boat once again, and clung to the seats with all his might to ride out the storm. When he would see a large piece of wreckage or spar heading in his direction, he would dive under the water and come back up once it had passed. Sutherland was not alone in his suffering. All around the wreckage of the Colima, people were clinging to boats and rafts that were getting swamped and upturned, and fewer people were regaining the surface. The female steerage passengers and the steerage passengers who had been from China were all lost in the explosion, since up until the end they were not allowed on deck. Some of the men in one of the steerage areas were able to escape as the ship went down, though not many of them. They had rushed to the steerage deck, but as more tried to follow them up, they had been blocked by guards, even though they struggled to also be allowed up. The guards had also cursed at any steerage passengers who had put on life preservers, and told them to put them back. There was Rowan on the steerage deck to thwart their orders, and so none of the steerage passengers had life preservers when the ship went down. All of the men who had escaped by means of the steerage deck were forced to cling to pieces of the wreckage, since they had no chance of making it to the boats when they were being launched, and hope for the best. This was true for many of the cabin passengers as well, especially the women and children and their servants, who had fled to their staterooms for shelter from the storm, only to be trapped in them when the ship had gone down. The survivors said that they had seen horrors in the water, but as it was a fight for their own lives, most of them had not been in a position to help others. First Mate Griffith was seen in a boat with some other members of the crew trying to pull the purser out of the water, but soon they were out of sight, and since they were never seen again, it was assumed that they were swamped soon after. The ship's storekeeper, a man named Richardson, found shelter by clinging to the roof of the deckhouse. Some other crew members climbed onto a piece of the bridge of the ship, to which they found the sleeve of Captain Taylor's coat still tied. The chief steward, who had argued with Rowan about the life preservers, had not escaped. He had been struck by a piece of flying timber when the ship had exploded. If anything, the storm grew more powerful for a time after the Colima sank. One of the passengers, who was from Kansas, said that he had been through his share of cyclones, and that it seemed like that was what was hitting them then, only much more powerful. It created a vortex that drew all of the wreckage and people together into dangerous proximity, and threw the survivors around violently into pieces of wreckage as they clung to makeshift rafts or struggled in boats. It was reported that those people who had not removed their clothing to swim better soon had their clothing ripped from them by the fury of the waves. At one point, The misery of those in the water was added to by a violent hailstorm that pelted them with large hailstones, followed by sleet. Then the storm passed by. There was a brief cold rain in the night, but the ocean was warm, and Sutherland said that he had been able to keep warm by resting with only his head above the water in his mostly submerged boat. Then it was over, and the sea became calm, to the extent that one survivor would say that he would have thought he was on a lake rather than the sea. Now it was a fight against exhaustion. And it is hard to know how many people let go of their hold on whatever they were clinging to, and were lost out of an inability to hold on any longer. It was therefore to the relief of everyone when around 8 in the morning the smoke of a steamship came into view. The ship proved to be the San Juan, another Pacific Mail steamship. Captain Pitt of the San Juan was given the startling information that there was a raft in the water with people on board. There would be some debate about how this information reached Captain Pitt. In one version, he suspected that there might have been a disaster in the terrible storm they had just suffered, and posted many lookouts, just in case they spotted anyone. In another version of the story, the cook was the one who saw the raft first and raised the alarm. One of the men on the raft simply shouted up to them the word Colima. With this, Captain Pitt realized that the Colima was no more. Captain Pitt, by all accounts, seemed to have been a reluctant rescuer. He stayed in the area at the latest 1 p.m., even though that was when they pulled up Rowan from the raft he was clinging to, so there were clearly people still alive in the water. Captain Pitt also did not have his crew play a particularly active role in the rescue. Initially, a boat with the second mate of the San Juan was lowered, but it was capsized, for undisclosed reasons, since it was reported that the water was calm. And with this, Captain Pitt seems to have almost decided he had done his duty. Captain Long, who was on board as a passenger, but had previously been captain of the Colima, made the request to Captain Pitt to launch another boat, and was told no. Undeterred, Captain Long went to the purser with his request and was given permission. On board the San Juan, the crew of the new ship for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, named the Aztec, was traveling, and Captain Long asked for volunteers from his crew to man the rescue boat. The only member from the San Juan crew that joined the rescue boat was the first mate. They would pull 14 passengers and 5 crew members from the water in total, before Captain Pitt seemed to have decided they had waited long enough and turned back to his regular course. Headed back to San Francisco. The people who watched this with the most horror were probably the people in the boat who had picked up storekeeper Richardson, who reported that they had seen the San Juan, but apparently the San Juan had not seen them, because they were left to row ashore to Manzanillo on their own. This would add to greater confusion later about how many had been saved, though the number was later reported to have been 31 in total. None of the women and children would be among those saved. The San Juan would also make a stop in Manzanillo and take on board those who wanted to travel back to San Francisco. From Manzanillo would also be telegraphed the first cryptic news of shipwreck. But they were so vague that no one would know anything for certain until the San Juan reached her home port. This was of no comfort to the families, who crowded the company offices in both San Francisco and New York asking for news of loved ones. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company was reluctant to even admit that the Colima had gone down, and one of the officers of the company in New York told worried loved ones that even if the ship had gone down, there was nothing to worry about because the ship had lifeboats, and the waters around Manzanillo during this time of year were smooth as a mill pond, and therefore there would be no danger. Just as there was no proper news of the Colima yet, there was also no news arriving in New York yet about the terrible hurricane that had ravaged the coast of Mexico, destroying everything in her wake. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company did not give the newspapers a chance to talk to Third Mate Hansen, who was the highest-ranking officer to survive the wreck, or storekeeper Richardson. They sent a tugboat out to meet the San Juan and take the two men off of the ship before she reached the dock. And once the tugboat reached the shore, the two men were whisked away in a carriage to the company offices. Third Mate Hansen was not even given a chance to return home to tell his wife that he was fine. When the two men emerged from the company offices, both men told the press that they had nothing to say. Captain Pitt also refused to comment even when faced with the allegations that he had left when there were still people to be saved. Many of the crew members of the Colima also refused to say anything, telling the newspaper reporters that they would not be compensated for their lost property by the company if they spoke. The passengers felt no such obligation, and all told their stories of horror. Soon, the newspapers were filled with stories of a lack of action from the crew, poorly stored cargo, and Captain Pitt prioritizing his schedule over human lives. The survivors were almost all injured, some of them badly, and the steerage passengers would also complain that while the cabin passengers had received medical attention, they had not, and had been forced to nurse one another back to health. Captain Pitt's actions would never result in anything other than public outrage. It was pointed out by the papers that there had been many formal complaints filed against the Pacific Mail Steamship Company about not keeping a schedule all up and down the Pacific coast, and perhaps Captain Pitt and the company as a whole were feeling the pressure to make their timetable no matter the cost. No reason for his early departure from the scene was ever given by Captain Pitt himself. The sinking of the Colima would result in an official inquiry, however, and it was an inquiry that would last weeks. There would be questions brought up that people had been asking the papers for some time. Had the engines of the Colima given out or broken down? The answer to this was no. They had been working up until the end. Had Captain Taylor ordered any sails or drags to keep his ship with her nose into the storm? Or had he counted on the engines to do all the work? Third Mate Hansen simply stated that no sails would have survived in the conditions they were in, so they had not attempted it. There had been no drags utilized. Had the Colima's cargo, or coal, shifted? The answer to this was also no, at least not as far as the officers and sailors could tell. Third Mate Hansen would testify that what had done in the Colima was nothing but the terrible winds they had found themselves in. It was testified to have been the worst storm that any sailor on the coast had ever experienced. As for the officers of the ship, they were all men of good reputation who had sailed for years, worked their way up, and in the case of the first and second mate, been captains of their own ships at one time or another. In the end, it was decided by the investigation that the Colima had been a recently repaired and staunch vessel with a well-stored cargo, and that she had not been carrying more than normal. All of the crew agreed that she had been sailing just as she always did, right up until she started to lose the battle with the storm. This decision was reinforced by the crew of another ship lost in the same storm, stating officially to a government official that there was not a ship in the world that could have survived the conditions that they had found themselves in, no matter how good of a ship. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company would still not be entirely out of trouble. The information that had come out during the investigation would lead to a second federal investigation that would look not only into the ship inspectors, but also into how the Pacific Mail Steamship Company conducted business as a whole. It was reported that the sanitation on their ships was horrible. They were never on time. The matter of deck cargo was forever a problem. They sent their ship top-heavy with little ballast, and, in general, could be considered a company that was bound to continue to have accidents. Mexico also took action after a disaster that had claimed at least 160 lives on their coast. The final number was never decided due to the servants and children not having been counted on the passenger lists, and some passengers having gotten on at Manzanillo, as well as some passengers getting off. While it was true that the hurricane had definitely been the main reason the Colima had sunk, the Mexican government ordered that ships with cargo entering their ports, as well as those being loaded, should be carefully inspected, and issued stricter rules for ships to prevent any chance of them being top-heavy in the future.
For more information, please see the San Francisco Call from June 11th, 1895, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.